This is News 24. I'm Erin Bates. We're sitting down with Kagiso Mamabolo. Did I say that correctly?
Correctly.
From the NSFAS department here in Cape Town, and he's going to be discussing the student funding program that is run by NSFAS in light of all the protests and action that we've seen at universities around the country. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting us.
Pleasure. I want to start off with some of the student protests that I've monitored over the last year, where students, for example, at the University of Fort Hare, have called on NSFAS and said, we're upset, we're not getting payments through for our accommodation, for our food, and it's impairing our ability to do our studies. Is your office keeping tabs on those kinds of protests?
Yes, of course. We do keep in tabs of recent developments happening regarding student protest. In fact, my office is responsible for student engagement and SRC capacity development and orientation. So what we do is that as soon as the new leadership of student leaders come into office, then we orientate them and we train them, workshop them on how to understand NSFAS and its processes. Simply because they command a large following of students, they must lead the students, and for them to effectively do their work, they need to understand how NSFAS operate. And we know that every year there's a new student leadership at all the institutions, and we are aware that sometimes student leaders are not in sync with decisions that are made by management, even though of the university, even though they relate to NSFAS. But to answer your question, you know, as NSFAS, what we have tried to do, we initially looked at the students that we were supporting. Our threshold ends at 120,000, and there was enough evidence that students that are above 120,000 income per household is not enough to actually make them afford a higher education. And then we developed a report and started investigating and actually advised the minister, because part of our job as NSFAS is to conduct research for the better utilization of financial resources, and also to advise the minister how to best allocate funding to deserving students. So the missing middle, even the coining of the missing middle, is the term that comes from NSFAS, from its own analysis and from its own discovery that learners from families whose parents are teachers, some of which are nurses, police officers, may not necessarily be able to afford higher education. So they fall within that threshold which we cannot fund. But it's not true that NSFAS has never funded the missing middle. In fact, we have sufficient proof that as we continue to investigate and come up with long-term solutions, we continue to fund some parts of the missing middle. That's why we introduced as NSFAS what we call expected family contribution, which means that once we do our analysis of income per family, we therefore say your family can afford paying 30% towards your fees, and NSFAS will take 70%. We don't do that for families that are very, very poor. We do that for the missing middle. Or we realize that some families have got 2 kids at university, NSFAS will take 1, and then the family will continue to educate the other. So the decision and the announcement made by the minister now is therefore to give an overall approach to say, how do we then integrate the entire missing middle team? With the wake of the fees must fall, government needed to respond urgently, and we had to implement as NSFAS that recommendation.